The day she arrived in Moose Jaw, the sky was the color of old tin, and the wind came off the prairie in long, flat gusts that pushed against her like a hand trying to turn her back east. She had one trunk. She had $11. She had the address of a man named Alderton written on the inside flap of her coat pocket, and a letter from his solicitor that described in careful legal language exactly nothing useful about what she was walking into. The stage left her at the edge of town near a feed merchant's that had its shutters half off. Nobody came to meet her. She stood there for a while. Then she picked up the trunk by the handle and started walking in the direction the solicitor's letter had described. The farm was 4 miles out. She had walked worse. She had found the advertisement in a Regina paper, folded into thirds and left on the seat of a church pew by someone who had no further use for it. The paper was 3 weeks old. The advertisement was shorter than most. Help wanted. Farm work, Moose Jaw District. Woman preferred. Experience with stock necessary. Write Alderton, Box 7. It did not say wife. It did not say housekeeper. It said help wanted. And at the time that was enough. She had written. He had written back. 2 letters, both of them brief to the point of rudeness which she had appreciated. The third letter contained train fare and the solicitor's address. She had not told anyone she was going. There was no one left to tell. The farm came into view past a long rise of land, and her first thought was that it was bigger than she'd expected. Her second thought was that it had been left alone for a long time. The fences were standing, but 2 of the posts along the east line had gone soft at the base and leaned outward like men trying to hear something from a distance. The barn roof had a seam of missing shingles along the north ridge. She could see the gap from 100 yards out. The yard itself had good bones. A wide approach, a solid-looking well, a chicken run with actual chickens in it, which was something. But the kitchen garden had gone to burdock and witchgrass, and the wood that should have been stacked by October was still in rounds near the chopping block, half buried in snow. She stopped at the gate. A man came out of the barn. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than the door frame quite accommodated, and he moved the way men move when something has been hurting them long enough that they've stopped noticing it hurts. His left arm swung normally. His right arm stayed close to his body, the hand turned slightly inward. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "You're earlier than I expected." She said, "The stage was on time." He nodded once and went back into the barn. She let herself into the house. The kitchen was cold, not the cold of a room left open to the air, but the deeper cold of a room that hadn't been properly heated in weeks. The firebox had ash in it from a fire that had gone out sometime in the night and hadn't been relit. She opened it and looked. There were coals buried at the bottom, still faintly warm. She found kindling in the box beside the stove. She found newspaper folded in a stack near the door. She had the fire going in 6 minutes. Then she stood in the kitchen and looked at it. The floor was clean, or had been cleaned recently enough that the effort was still visible. The dishes were stacked in a dry rack. A pot sat on the stove that held the residue of beans cooked and eaten several days ago, the bottom faintly scorched. There were no curtains on the windows. There was a nail where curtains had once hung. The nail was still there. The curtains were not. She opened the door to the larder and took account. Salt pork, oats, a sack of flour that was still more than half full, dried beans, 2 kinds, a small amount of lard, 6 jars of something she couldn't identify until she held one to the light. Saskatoon preserves put up badly, the seal on 2 of the jars already starting to lift. One remained good. She set it aside. She went back to the firebox and added wood. He came in when the light had shifted to the low yellow mid-afternoon. He stopped at the door and looked at the stove, which was now burning properly, and at the table, which had a pot of beans soaking in water and a pan of something else on the heat. He said, "You found the kitchen," she said. "The beans need 6 more hours. We can have the oat cake now if you're hungry." He sat down at the table without answering. She set a plate in front of him and poured water from the kettle into 2 tin cups and sat across from him. He ate. She ate. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. After a while, he said, "I didn't put your name in the advertisement because I wasn't certain what arrangement I was proposing." She said, "What arrangement are you proposing?" He looked at the table. He had a way of going quiet that didn't feel like evasion so much as a kind of careful gathering of himself, the way a man reaches for a tool he's not certain he remembers how to use. He said, The farm needs more than I can do. My hand. He stopped. I was in an accident in September. A horse fell. My shoulder was. It hasn't come back the way the doctor said it would. She waited. He said, I have 40 head of cattle, 12 of them dairy. I have 60 acres under cultivation, or was. I have an arrangement with the co-op in town that depends on me delivering by April. She said, that's 6 weeks. 7. If March holds, she said, it won't. He looked at her for the first time since he'd sat down. Not a long look, more like a check, verifying something. She said, I'll need to know the state of the dairy operation. He said, I can show you tomorrow. She said, show me now, before the light goes. The dairy barn was in better shape than the yard suggested. He had kept it clean, or kept it as clean as one arm could manage, which was cleaner than most. Cows were a mixed herd, mostly shorthorn, the dairy portion clearly identifiable by the way they moved toward the sound of her voice without being asked. Animals that have been handled well remember kindness. Animals that have been frightened remember that too. She walked the line of them and looked at their legs and their flanks and their eyes. She checked the water trough. She checked the bedding. She looked at the milking setup, and then she turned to him. She said, how often are you milking? He said, every day. She said, morning and evening. A pause. I've been doing what I can, she said. They need to be milked twice a day, every day without exception. A cow that's milked once and skipped once will start to struggle. You'll see it in the production first and then in the health, he said. I know what a dairy cow needs, she said. Then you know you're short. He said nothing. She had not said it to wound him. She had said it because it was true, and because a thing being true was sufficient reason to say it. She looked at the animals again. They were in reasonable condition. Whatever he had been unable to do, he had not let the animals suffer more than the situation demanded. She filed that away. She said, I'll take the morning milking. You take evenings as long as you're able. We'll reassess in a week, he said. You don't know what you're taking on, she said. I've milked dairy cattle since I was 9 years old in a barn in Manitoba, where the temperature in January went to 40 below and the lantern froze to the nail it hung on. I know what I'm taking on. He looked at her again. That same checking look. Longer this time. He said, there's a room off the kitchen. It has a door. She said, that'll do. The room was small and had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which she preferred. There was a bed frame with a mattress and a quilt folded at the foot. On the wall, there was a hook. Beside the hook, someone had marked the height of a child in pencil, 3 different measurements, the highest one reading Janie, June 1894. She did not ask about Janie. She hung her coat on the hook and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle around her. There was a photograph on the small table beside the bed. She turned it to face the wall. It seemed like the right thing to do. The first week she learned the land. She woke before him every morning and went to the barn in the dark with the lantern and milked. She knew within 3 days which cows were reliable producers and which were beginning to flag. She knew within 4 days that the northeast pasture fence had a gap where the cattle had been pushing through in the night, not escaping, just moving, the way animals press against whatever gives. She repaired the gap with wire she found in the implement shed, using a fencing plier and her knee as a lever. He watched her do it from across the yard. He did not come to help. She did not ask him to. On the 5th day, she pulled up the burdock in the kitchen garden. The ground was still half frozen and it was hard going. She worked for 3 hours before her hands stopped cooperating. Then she went inside and stood at the stove with her palms flat against the warming iron until she could feel them again. He came in while she was standing there. He saw her hands. He went to the larder and came back with a small tin that had no label. He set it on the table beside her without saying anything and went back to his chair by the window. She opened it. Some kind of rendered fat mixed with something that smelled like pine resin. She worked it into her knuckles and the heels of her hands. By evening, the cracking had stopped. She did not thank him out loud. She put the tin back where he'd left it. The neighbor came on the 8th day, a woman named Dorrit Mackay, who arrived in a cutter from the farm to the west, and knocked with the particular firmness of someone who knocks as a courtesy rather than a question. She was 60 or close to it, with a face that had been outdoors for most of those years, and had adjusted accordingly. She looked at the woman standing in the kitchen doorway. She said, "So he finally got someone in." The woman said, "Yes." Dorrit Mackay looked past her at the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of bread. The first bread she had baked that morning because the flour was there and she had time after the milking. Dorrit's expression shifted, not quite to approval, but to something in the neighborhood of it. She came in. She sat down at the table. She accepted tea. She said, "You know about the wife." The woman said, "I know there was one." Dorrit said, 3 years ago, come February, she and the girl both. There was a fever came through the district. She turned the teacup in her hands. He wasn't right after, you can see it. He let things go. The woman said, "He kept the animals." Dorrit looked at her. "He did. A man who keeps his animals is not all the way gone." Dorrit was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He doesn't talk about it, I know. Does it bother you?" She said, "Not particularly. The fence is what bothered me. The fence is fixed." Dorrit laughed, a short, dry sound like a branch cracking. She stayed for an hour and then got back in the cutter and drove home. At the gate she turned and called back, "You need anything, you send to me." The woman said, "Thank you." She meant it. By the third week she had established something like a rhythm, and a rhythm on a farm is not a small thing. It is the thing the farm runs on. She was up at 5, barn by 5:15, milking done and cows fed by 7. Back the house, fire up, breakfast made. He ate. She ate. Then the day's work would change according to what the day required. In that period it required repair of the implement shed door, which had lost a hinge and was catching wind, taking account of the remaining winter feed and working out whether it would cover the herd through to April grass, writing to the co-op in town to advise them of the spring schedule, mending 3 places in the south fence, and beginning, slowly, the work of clearing the root cellar, which had not been properly organized in what appeared to be 2 years. He worked beside her on most of it, not all of it, and not always easily. His shoulder dictated the limits, and she had learned to read those limits without naming them. But he was present. He was not the man she had expected from the state of the yard. The yard had told her a story of a man who had stopped, but watching him work, she thought the truer story was of a man who had slowed, who had lost his footing somewhere inside himself and was still, very carefully, trying to find it again. He didn't speak much. Neither did she. They developed a language of gesture and timing that was, she thought, more efficient than most speech anyway. One afternoon, toward the end of that week, she was stacking feed sacks in the barn, and she heard him, outside, speaking to one of the horses in a low voice. Not words, really, more like sounds. The horse was an older mare, gray at the muzzle, and he had his good hand on her neck and his face turned slightly away, the way people turn when they don't want to be seen doing something tender. She went back to stacking the co-op man, a man named Beckett, came out in the 4th week to discuss the spring arrangement. He was younger than she'd expected, with the watchful efficiency of someone who had learned early that time in the field was time not spent at a desk, and he had strong opinions about both. He spoke mostly to the man. That was fine. She listened. At one point he mentioned a problem with the Eastern producer's delivery schedule that would push the collection date back 2 weeks. She said, without particularly raising her voice, "That puts us into mud season. You'll lose a quarter of the cream on the road." Beckett looked at her. She said, "Push it forward, not back. 1st week of April before the thaw runs. It's the same distance from our gate as from the Halverson place, and they've been doing April 1st since before the railway." Beckett looked at the man who was leaning against the barn wall with his arms folded. The man said, "She's right." Beckett thought about it. He said, "I'll see what I can arrange." After he left, the man said, "You knew about the Halverson place," she said. "Dorrit Mackay told me. She talks. I listen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's useful." She said, "I know. There was a storm in the 2nd week of February that kept them inside for 2 days. Not the worst storm. She had been in worse, much worse, but a sustained and serious one, the kind that makes a farm's weaknesses visible by contrast. The north window in the kitchen let in cold. Not a lot, but enough. She stuffed the gap with a strip of rag and then found a board in the shed and cut it down and fitted it against the frame. He watched her do this from across the room. He said, "I meant to get to that," she said. "It's done now," he said. "There's a list. I kept a list of things that needed doing," she said. "Where is it?" He went to the shelf beside the door and brought down a piece of paper. Folded many times, she unfolded it. It was a long list, written in 2 different scripts, the top half in careful block letters, the bottom half in a looser hand that she recognized as his. The careful letters were older, faded to the color of weak tea. She looked at the list. She did not say anything about the handwriting. She set it on the table and said, "We can work through this by March," he said. "Some of it I can't." He stopped. She said, "I know which ones. I'll handle those." He said, "You don't need to." She said, "I didn't say I needed to." He looked at the list on the table. He looked at his right hand, which was resting on the arm of his chair at that angle it had settled into. He said, "Why did you come here?" It was not quite a question. It was the kind of thing people say when they are trying to understand something that the available facts don't fully explain. She said, "There was nothing left where I was." He said, "What happened?" She said, "My husband died. Then the farm. Then my mother. Then there wasn't anything left that had my name on it anywhere." He said nothing. She said, "I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked." He said, "I didn't know I was asking." She said, "You were." The storm pushed against the north window. The board she'd fitted held it. The calving started in March, 2 weeks early, because the season did not consult the calendar. She was in the barn at 2 in the morning when the first heifer began. She had checked at midnight, checked again at 1, and by 2 it was clear that things were not proceeding as they should. She did what needed to be done, methodically, without panic, the way she had done it before, and would do it again. He arrived at the barn at 2:30, having seen the lantern stay lit too long. He stood at the stall gate. She was already through the worst of it. She looked up at him and said, "Heifer calf, she's all right. The calf is small, but she's breathing." He said, "Did you need?" She said, "I'm all right." He came in anyway. He took the calf in his good arm and held her while she cleaned up. He did not say anything, neither did she. The heifer stood and turned and found her calf and began the work that mothers do. After, they sat on the straw bales near the door. He had brought a lantern. She was tired in the particular way of hard physical work done in cold at an unusual hour. He was tired in some other way. He said, "You're not afraid of any of it," she said. "I'm afraid of things," he said. "I haven't seen it," she said. "You haven't seen everything." He was quiet. The lantern threw a steady light. Outside, the cold had eased slightly, one of those small mercies that February sometimes produces without warning. He said, "My wife was from Ontario. She came out here when we married, and she spent the first winter deciding whether she'd made a mistake." He paused. By spring, she'd decided she hadn't. She liked it. She said it was honest country. She said, "It is." He said, "Janid was born here." She'd never known anything else. He looked at the calf, which was up now, unsteady but trying. "She would have liked this," she said. "Tell me about her." He looked at her. She said, "Not if you don't want to, but you can if you want." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She was 7. She had my wife's eyes and her own opinions about everything. She had strong feelings about the chickens. She named all of them. She said, 'They don't deserve it, but they appreciate it.'" He almost smiled, not quite. But she saw the movement of it at the corner of his mouth, and she filed it away. By the end of March, the list on the table was half done. The fence was repaired. The north window was sealed. The implement shed had a functioning door. The root cellar was organized, cataloged, and restocked with what Dorrit had brought over and what she had managed to put by from the winter's work. The dairy herd was producing properly, twice daily, every day, no exceptions, and the numbers she was keeping in a small notebook showed steady improvement in yield. The man's shoulder had not gotten better, exactly, but he had found new ways to use it. She had watched him learn this without saying anything about it, which she suspected was the correct approach. The wrong approach would have been to notice out loud. Some things a person needed to figure out in private. Co-op man came back in the last week of March and confirmed the first week of April collection date. He spoke to her directly this time. Dorrit came on Thursdays, usually, and stayed for an hour or 2. She and the woman had arrived at something like friendship, which for both of them meant a great deal of plain-spoken, practical conversation and very little sentimentality, and suited them both. One Thursday, Dorrit said, "The district's talking." She said, "I know." Dorrit said, "Are you bothered by it?" She said, "People talk. It stops when something else gives them reason." Dorrit said, "He's better." She said, he's working. That helps. Dorrit said, it's more than that. She looked at the woman in the way that older women sometimes look at younger ones when they are trying to communicate something for which there is no particularly good language. He came into the feed merchant's last week, stood and talked to Garvey for 20 minutes. First time since the fall. She said, good. Dorrit said, that's all you have to say about it? She said, what would you like me to say? Dorrit laughed her branch-cracking laugh and poured herself more tea. The collection went well. The spring came, which in that part of Saskatchewan means it arrived approximately as violently as winter had, with mud and melt, and a week of hard, warm wind that changed the whole character of the land almost overnight. The pasture greened. The kitchen garden came back, partly from her work clearing it in February, and partly from whatever the original gardener had put down years before that still remembered itself underground. She planted what she could. She ordered seed from town. She wrote it all in the notebook. He came to stand beside her in the kitchen garden one afternoon, watching her work the soil. He said, that corner was hers, my wife's. She planted flowers there, not useful ones. She looked at the corner. The soil there was different, better. Someone had tended it. She said, I'll leave it, he said. You don't have to, she said. I want to, he said. You don't even know what she put there, she said. It'll come up or it won't. Either way, it was hers. He looked at her. One of those long, checking looks that had become over the months something she recognized as a particular form of communication, his way of saying something he didn't have words for yet. He said, I'd like you to stay. She went on working the soil. She said, I know. He said, that's not an answer. She said, it is. It's just a slow one. He said, how slow? She sat back on her heels and looked at the earth under her hands, which was dark and workable and good. She said, ask me again in the fall, after the harvest's in. He said, why the fall? She said, because by then you'll know whether you mean it, and I'll know whether I can. He was quiet. She said, I'm not in a hurry. This is good work and it's honest country, and I'm not going anywhere. She looked up at him. That's not nothing. He said, no, it's not. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. The summer came, and with it the long days that Saskatchewan does generously. Light until 10, sky wide enough to feel like a gift or a burden depending on the day. The farm found its footing. She found hers. She could move through the barns in the dark by memory now. She knew which floorboard in the kitchen gave under her heel, which gate latch needed lifting before turning, which cow would move left instead of right when she brought the bucket in. She knew the sound of the house in wind, and the sound of it in calm, and the sound it made in the early morning when he was up before her, which had started happening in June. Him first to the barn, her second, a reversal that had come about without discussion or announcement. She kept the notebook. In it she had milk yields by week and by cow, pasture rotation schedule, feed inventory, dates of repair and cost of materials, a record of the kitchen garden by row and variety, a record of the calves, their mothers, their weights at birth and at 8 weeks. At the back of the notebook, in a page she had not shown anyone, she had written a different kind of list. It was a list of things she had not had in a long time and now had again. A fire in the morning, a reason to be up before the light, ground under her that was not going anywhere. She did not write a person to be alongside because she was not entirely sure yet what to call that. The harvest came in at the end of August. It was a good one, not exceptional, but solid, the kind that a practical person plans for and feels satisfied by. She and the man worked it together and hired a boy named Stellan from the adjacent property for 3 weeks. A quiet 17-year-old who did what he was told and asked good questions and went home every evening to his own family. On the last evening of the harvest, after Stellan had gone home and the grain was in, and the light was going gold over the flats to the west, she and the man sat on the step of the house and ate the meal she had made, a simple one, nothing particular, and watched the dark come in. He said, "It's fall," she said. "Yes," he said. "You said to ask you in the fall." She looked at the field that was resting now, put to bed for the season, all that summer's effort folded into the ground to wait. She said, "Ask then." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you stay?" She thought about Manitoba, which was a long time ago. She thought about the farm she had lost and the people she had lost with it. She thought about the nail on the wall where curtains had once been and the mark on the door frame that said Janie, June 1894. She thought about her hands in February on the warming iron and the tin with no label that had appeared beside her without a word. She said, "Yes." He nodded right hand, which rested on his knee at its particular angle. He said, I don't know how to do this well. It's been a long time, she said. Neither do I. It's been a long time for me too. He said, that doesn't bother you, she said. Two people who don't know how is different from one person who doesn't know how. It's more even. He was quiet for a long time. The dark came all the way in. The stars showed themselves over the flat land. He said, Janie would have liked you. She felt something shift in her chest, careful and irreversible, the way ice moves in a river in April, not breaking exactly, but giving way to the season. She said, tell me more about her. He did.